have been talking a lot about justice in the last few weeks, and I have wanted to make sure that we understand some things and that we get some things as foundational. As we have been trying to talk about this, we want to make the case that real justice can only happen in the church under God's authority. That real justice is only in His way. That He has created structures and He has created ways of living and ways of acting and ways of doing that are in and of themselves just. And so we've talked about how the entire Old Testament really has been geared toward creating justice. And actually, it is maintained through God's ways, through the Old Covenant. And as we look at the New Testament and we take a look at what Romans is talking about, now we understand that there is a new righteousness that is through Jesus Christ. And when we're talking about righteousness in the New Testament, we're talking about how that word righteous and justice are the same word. And so really we can use those words interchangeably. And so we understand that God is creating justice and He is creating righteousness. And if we are going to have justice and righteousness, really it can only be under God's rule. And the only place that happens on the face of the planet, the only place that happens in reality is in the church. And so we want to make that case. We have further tried to emphasize that by living the way that Jesus lives, by living in the way that He makes it possible for us to live, we demonstrate to everyone on earth, and we also demonstrate in the heavenly realms, that place where it's not just God and His angels, but it is in that spiritual realm where Satan and his legions also live. By us living in the way that we are supposed to live, that we demonstrate to the world and we demonstrate to the principalities and powers that God's way is right, that God's way is just, that God's way and His will be done, and it is done. It is a death nail for Satan and his legions. That's what it is as we live in the way that He wants us to live. But herein lies the difficulty. There is so much injustice on earth, isn't there? When we look around us, we see this. We recognize it as such. It bothers us, and it makes us angry to see what is going on. In large part, the reason why I'm talking about justice at all in these last few weeks is because of the great injustice we see around us in general. And we can talk about those injustices that we see in general. We can talk about, it seems like every time I turn around and I look at my social media and I see what people are posting and what they're talking about, we see, hey, we need to be thinking about this thing, or we need to be thinking about this thing. And what are those things? Well, what about child labor in the third world? What about child exploitation in Lancaster County? Lancaster County is rocked right now because just a couple of months ago, there was an Amish girl that was abducted. We don't know where she is. And we hate to think about what horrors are being visited on her if she's still alive even. We know these things and we see these things and we understand that there is injustice in these ways, and it shakes us to our core and it makes us upset. We see this injustice in general, but we also have seen great injustice this past year against George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, specifically in the African American community. And we see all this, and it has caused an understandable outpouring and protest and a less than justifiable outbreak of violence. And we see all this. And our difficulty comes in our seeing all of this and knowing how to deal with this as the Lord's church. As we take a look at ourselves as the Lord's church, we are wondering exactly what is our responsibility to the world at large? How in the world are we supposed to work in that? If true justice is within the confines of the church, is this the place where justice is meted out? What do we do as the Lord's church? I am convinced of this, through all the noise, through all the distraction, through all the talking points that we hear and the counter-talking points that we hear. Through all of that the world throws at us, we must still strive to be the church. I'm going to try to lay out some things over the next couple of weeks about what we can do practically speaking. I believe that we've laid the groundwork for God's justice. I believe that we've talked about how he is just in and of himself. Just as we talk about God is love, we can also talk about God is holy, and we can talk about God is just. These are part and parcel of who he is. We cannot parse it out. We cannot take it out. It is part of who he is. And so I want us to understand this, and I want us to understand this because it's foundational for how we need to act and how we need to live in the church. There has been great criticism of the church in the past, and maybe some of it is justified. As we take a look at the church of the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, there have been racial tensions, there have been racist tendencies in the church. And that should not be. That should never be. But if we are being criticized at this point, it may be because, if we're not being criticized at this point, it may be because we are being seen as completely irrelevant, as standing apart from it and not even engaging in any kind of reasonable or authentic way to what is going on. But if we, as a church, act like a church, we will not only be considered relevant, we will also silence critics. And we must strive to be the church. We are meaning to be the church. And I am convinced of this. If we are not growing, if we as a church are not growing, then we are not being the church. As we live as a church, as we mete out justice, as people see us engaging in our own ways to get rid of injustice among ourselves, and as that flows out into the world, I believe that is something that people want to see. And I believe that the church will grow because of it. If we don't do this, I believe the consequences are dire. As we take a look at Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3, we see Jesus speaking to the churches. And we can talk about that, Thyatira and Pergamum and Philadelphia and Laodicea and all those churches. And what we see there oftentimes is a warning that if you are not going to act like the church, then Jesus takes away your right to even be a church. You are not the church unless you are acting in the ways that God wants you to act. Unless we are acting in justice, unless we are acting in love, unless we are acting in those ways. But I believe that justice is front and center of who we are. And we can put it this way: if we are the church, we will work justice. If we are working justice, we are the church. They are the two sides of the same coin. And I realize some of this might seem like an overemphasis, but really the entirety of what we do as a church, evangelism, charity work, body life, all of this is working out of God's justice. We got to understand this. But now, a righteousness apart from the law has come through Jesus Christ. That's Romans. We have to understand that as we preach the gospel to a lost and dying world, what we are really doing is we are preaching justice. We are preaching a justice that comes from Jesus Christ. It comes through Jesus Christ. And so these things are possible. As we mete out charity work, as we are involved in body life, all this is working out God's justice. Love is a motivation, but justice is a result. I want us to take a look at Ephesians chapter 4. That's where we're going to be. And the passage that I have there is from Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1. And I want us to take a look at Ephesians chapter 4 as we go through today's lesson, because I think that there are some things there that we can see. And I still think that this is foundational stuff. I'm not completely convinced that we're getting exactly where we want to be in terms of talking about the practical outpouring of it, but this is practical. There's a lot of practicality here, and I want us to see exactly what is going on here. Love is the motivator. Justice is the outcome. As we take a look at what these verses say, I'm going to read them first, and I want us to hear them because I think that it is important for us to do so. And as we listen to this, I am sure that a lot of what we are reading is going to be familiar to us. As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. But to each one of us, grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. This is why it says, when he ascended on high, he led captives in his train and gave gifts to men. And we talked about that last week, about how we have been raised up with Christ and we are seated in the heavenly realms. And we understand that in a sense, we are muddling through this earth right here, but there is a sense where we are with Jesus Christ in the heavenly realms. But the other thing is that heavenly realms is not just heaven itself, but it is also all the spiritual realms, and how we act and what we do has ramifications for what people see. What does he ascended mean? This is verse 9. Except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions. He who descended is the very one who has ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe. It was he who gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, and some to be pastors and teachers, to prepare God's people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining the full measure of the fullness of Christ. Then we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of men and their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into him who is the head, that is Christ. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love, just as each part does its work. And I want us to go back to verse 1, and I want us to hit this part very, very clearly. As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to walk. Now, I know that a lot of us have NIVs, okay, New International Version, and it's a fine version. You can get to heaven on an NIV. You can get to heaven on any translation of the Bible that's out there. I believe that. But I think sometimes we have to understand exactly what the meaning is and what is going on here. And I think that the NIV does us an injustice when it says, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Because live to me seems very, very passive. I can be living in my living room. I can be breathing. I can be doing all of that, and I am living in a certain way. Now, I understand that the context here does not allow for that. But when I take a look at that idea of living, I get that passive being verb type feel. I am, or I seem, or something like that. But the word is walk. And when I think about walking, that's an active thing. I run. I try to run. Some of us run. Some of us try to run. During the school year, it's kind of hard because the days get shorter and darker earlier, and schoolwork kind of keeps me from being able to do all the running that I'd like to do. But I run. And let me tell you something, when I run, those first few steps are the hardest. After about 100 yards or so, I'm starting to find my stride, and the synovial fluid is starting to work my ankles and my joints, and I'm able to move a little bit more, and I'm okay. I see some laughter out there, that's all right. But when I am moving and doing that, I am being active, and what Paul says is, I urge you. It's not just pretty please. It is, I am begging you. I am beseeching you. I am beseeching you to walk. I am beseeching you to walk. I am beseeching you to be active in what the calling is that God gave you. And as we take a look at what Ephesians said last week, we were talking about being active in making sure that that dividing wall of hostility is broken down between Jew and Gentile, between African American and white American, between Hispanic and Asian, whatever else you want to talk about. It is going to be active. It's not just a matter of us just sitting together or anything like that. It is going to be active. It is going to be a walking together. It is going to be an interacting. It is going to be active. We are to walk. We are to move and to live out the calling that Jesus called us to. And I think that another thing that we see here is that we need to make sure that we look out of ourselves. Well, maybe that doesn't necessarily make sense. What do I mean by that? Well, the fact of the matter is, I think that what Paul is saying here is when he's saying, when I'm saying this, let's take a look at verse 2. It says, be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love. Let's just get down to it. That's not easy. Because everything that I am has a tendency to see things from my perspective. I see things from the way that I am. And I think that that would have been the way it was before the fall, but I think after the fall, it's even worse. We get so caught up into a qualitative analysis of our perspective. Somehow my perspective is better than your perspective. Somehow the way that I'm thinking is better than how you are thinking. But the thing is, as I take a look at my perspective, I can look at it from a physical standpoint, and we can understand that we need to see things differently. I'm standing here. I can see my daughter in front of me. Over here to my right, I have a wall and a door leading to the woods. Over to my left, I have a street that goes out that direction. Everything is geared toward right here. It's right here in my head. It's in my perspective. If I turn around, then my perspective changes a little bit, but everything is here, right here. That is not the perspective that you have right there, right now. Those of you who are at home watching this on video, you have an entirely different perspective. But when we bring that up into the spiritual realm, when we bring that up into the interpersonal realm, when we bring that up into the working together realm, it's not just a matter of who's in front of me or what's beside me or anything like that. It is a matter of what is your perspective, what is your life like, what is going on in your life. Can I see from your perspective the whole idea of being able to walk in somebody else's shoes, the whole ability to see things from somebody else's viewpoint and eyes. And what Paul is talking about here is completely humble and gentle, patient, bearing with one another in love. That means that we're going to have to see things from other people's perspective, and we're going to have to get out of ourselves. We're going to have to be able to see what other people see. But I see that what Paul is also talking about is he is wanting to make sure that we strive for unity. And this is verses 3 through 6. And we see, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. And then he again goes into that part. He again goes into that section where he wants to explain why that is so important. And that's such a beautiful passage right there with one body, one Spirit, called to one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father over all. We see all that. That's one. But there's something that we are needing to do, because that is not a natural thing. And so we need to be working toward that unity. We need to be making sure that we have that oneness. And that is work. We are striving for that unity, trying to make sure that that works. Making sure that we are one in spirit and purpose, as Philippians chapter 2 talks about. Making sure that there is that unity. Seeing things from another person's perspective is going to help us get there, isn't it? It's going to help us to move and work together. But I also see that Paul recognizes a diversity of gifts. In verses 7 through 13, he talks about some were given to be apostles and prophets, and some evangelists, and some to be pastors, and all of these things that they were supposed to, that they were doing. And I am completely convinced that God gives people. He gifts people. It's hard for me to say. G-I-F-T-S. I couldn't even spell it. He gifts people with exactly what the church needs. And he does that in various ways. I'm not exactly sure how the Spirit does that. I don't exactly know all the ins and outs of all of that. I don't get all that. But I know that that is what he does. And I believe fully that all of our experiences, everything that we have gone through, is part of a shaping that God does to make us perfect, to be able to accomplish the things that he wants us to accomplish. And so it's not just a matter of me doing one thing, but it's also a matter of you doing another, and somebody else doing another. And yes, there may be overlap, and maybe we work together on some things in a certain particular area that we're gifted in. But we also have to recognize that another person is just as gifted in another area. And Paul makes it very clear in chapter 2, and he makes it clear in other places in the passages. There is not one gift that's more important than another. But we are all given these gifts. And as we take a look at our different perspectives and we take a look at our different gifts and we take a look at all of that, what we see is that we are able to work together and create a unity with our diversity of gifts. I think it's interesting in Luke chapter 7, verse 35, there's a passage where Jesus, in Luke 7:35, he says, wisdom is proven right by all her children. And I love that particular passage. That is a passage where John's disciples come to Jesus and they're asking him about who he is. And they're asking him if he is the one that they were supposed to be waiting for. And Jesus says, look, you see the miracles. Go and tell John what you've seen. And blessed is the person who doesn't fall away on account of me, on account of these things. And then Jesus, he goes and he talks to those people that he's been preaching to. He talks to his disciples and he talks about everything that he has been doing. And he's talking about John, and he's talking about how John is not a well-dressed man. He's talking about all of that. And then in verse 29, it says, all the people, even the tax collectors, when they heard Jesus' words, acknowledged that God's way was right because he had been baptized by John. We have this idea, once again, of righteousness. We have this idea of justice. God's way is right. They had accepted this because they had accepted John's baptism. And it says that the Pharisees and the experts in the law rejected God's purpose for their lives because they had not been baptized by John. And then Jesus, he talks about this generation, and he says, I can compare them to children sitting in the marketplace, calling out to one another, we played a flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not cry. John the Baptist came not eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say he is a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, but wisdom is proven right by all her children. And I think what's going on here, Jesus is saying, it doesn't matter what background you're coming from. It doesn't matter what you bring to the table. As you recognize God's justice in your life, as you come into the kingdom with everything that you have, then you have proven God right and just. Because just as God has made a way open for all people, no matter where you're coming from. And even if you're a tax collector and a sinner, you come to the kingdom with all of that you have experienced, and it is justified, it is made right, it is made clean, and everything that you have within you gets to be used for kingdom business now, in the right way. Justice is proven right by all her children. And because of that, because of our ability to recognize the diversity of gifts and use those diversity of gifts as we are striving for unity, as we are getting out of ourselves, as we are walking this walk. Then verse 14, we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of men and their deceitful scheming. And I keep on looking back to what Jesus compared this generation to in Luke 7:35, and I see that he compares them to children. And children are a wonderful thing in a lot of passages in the Scripture, but in that particular passage of Scripture, Jesus is not talking about children in any kind of delightful way. He's talking about the pettiness that sometimes children demonstrate. Well, you won't let me play my way, so I'm taking my ball and going home. Jesus wasn't playing their way. God wasn't playing their way. John the Baptist wasn't playing their way. And so they said, he's crazy, or he's a drunkard, whatever else they said about John and Jesus. No longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of men and their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into him who is the head, that is Christ. As I take a look at the passage of 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 11, Paul says, when I was a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things. Do you know what that's in the context of? Yes, we know that that's in the context of that love passage. But all of that has to do with the church using its gifts and using its abilities to become one. And And the Corinthians had a huge problem with getting together and being unified. They were suing one another. They were involved in all sorts of kinds of immorality. And Paul says, knock it out. Knock it off. You're not to be of Paul. You're not to be of Apollos. You're supposed to be of Christ. And you're supposed to be using your gifts to grow together. And you're acting like children. I used to think that way. But when I became a man, I put childish things away from me, reaching maturity. As I take a look at a world that is out there right now, as I take a look at what is going on, how many people do we see walking in a way that is in any kind of way, I'm thinking of check words, in any kind of way righteous? How do we see any kind of justice? How do we see people walking in a way that is in any way worthy of any kind of accolade or respect? Very few. Do we see people who are looking to their own interests, or do we see people who are looking out to the interests of others? Do we see people out there in the world who are striving for unity, or do we see a separation? I'm sorry, I don't like to get into politics, and I'm not going to, really, but you know what? This election, if you listen to the people on the radio right now, is the most important election in all of history. As was the election in 2016, if I recall. As was the election in 2012, as I recall. As was the election in 2008, as I recall. 2004, as I recall. 2000, as I recall. We live in a world that is bent on dividing and separating and making people into us and them. It happens because it's the world. And we, as a church, are called to be something different. We must be different. And as we do that, and as we reach this full maturity, being whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, growing and building itself up in love as each part does its work, the world will take notice. How are things at your church? This is how we live. This is how we interact. This is how we deal with politics. This is how we deal with all the stuff that is out there. This is what we do. This is a service that we do. This is how we interact with one another. Really, that's different than what I've been hearing. It has an impact. It makes a difference. Brings people into curiosity, and curiosity breeds questioning, and questioning brings answers. And answers can bring salvation. We as a church are the core. If you're not part of the Lord's body, you don't know what that's all about. You can't taste that, you can't see it, you can't sense it. God's justice is open for all, and He wants all to be His children. If you've decided that this is the day to make that happen, whether you are at home or here, please don't go away without making it so.